We're covering accessory selection. Exercise selection is a huge part of your program. You can fiddle around all you want with set and rep schemes or different splits or arrangements of progression. And that's important and it's all well and good, but it is not the end all be all. In fact, exercise selection, I would argue, especially early on, is probably the most important decision you can make. There are certain exercises that are just known for providing immense carryover as long as you do them consistently and as long as you train them hard. And that takes a lot of guesswork out. It gives you a ton of wiggle room. And that's always good when we're trying to balance all of these variables to get a specific desired result. So we're going to talk about how to implement these variations for continued growth and which specific things that we're going to focus on when we are trying to select those, because there's certain criteria that needs to be met and it all depends on you, where you're at, what you've done previously. There are all these individual factors we need to get into. So let's get into it. The purpose of our accessory movements are to complement the main movement. So just about everybody is going to be following some type of program where there is a main movement. And these are either the competitive movements that have to be practiced, or they are the movements that we deem the most beneficial developmentally. And for 95% of people, so many people, squatting, benching, deadlift, pressing, rowing, those are the big ones. And they get duplicated sometimes kind of well, sometimes pretty poorly in dumbbell variations, machine variations, specialty bars, and so on. So usually things will hinge around the main movement and all the practice we need with that. And then the extra work we do is done to supplement that work, because the idea is that the development we get from doing those movements, it might be good, but it won't be good forever. And it could be better if we can get good at targeting weak areas and figuring out how to round ourselves out, because we have to be more efficient. So general development, that's the big one. That's the primary reason why you should always be doing some type of variation, why very few people, I would argue no people really, should be just doing the main lifts if you have the option to incorporate some accessories in some way. Although there are some programs that work, but they're not going to work indefinitely. And they tend to work best for people that are already the cream of the crop. And you can take that a step further if we're going to go on a little aside here. What should we do with new lifters? Because things that just focus on a few barbell lifts seem to work pretty damn well. So I could see people in the audience saying, what the hell are you talking about? Starting strength is wonderful. Grayscale LP is wonderful. These programs that are very simplistic and only use barbell movements because they're so good, they are good. But new people, when they have the option, whether it's in a sport or lifting or anything else, should widen their base out. That means variety. So the idea is that specific, hyper-specific ways of training are best suited to those who are the most specialized in the world, and not so much for everybody else. And it's also in a novice's best interest to learn how to juggle variety. So that's my rant on that. General development, however you want to get it, whatever your method of pursuit is the most important thing. And accessories can increase size and strength in more places. It can pack on meat in ways that just the main lifts won't. Interesting aside, the way that your body is going to store muscle is going to be different from person to person, assuming that you're all doing the same lift. Everybody who benches will find different weak points. It depends on their build, their leverages, where their tendons insert, all of these things. So that's a really important point. I myself, from pressing, got huge shoulders. I mean, I don't know how big they are right now, but they're not a lot to write home about. But that was entirely from pressing. My arms, you can't really see. I wish I was like Israel. I don't know. I've been corrected before. But I wish I, had the swollenness. I wish I had the girth in my arms to prop them up on the desk. So, I could really command. So I got to use the foreshortening from the camera to really command some respect. Be like, yeah, I know what the fuck I'm talking about. But my arms did not grow for shit from doing basic pressing and rowing movements. I still got strong. I still put meat on my body. They still pack a lot of punch. Most bang for your buck, and I will stand by that. But there was more I could have been doing and should have been doing, and weaknesses would have been prevented, and I would have been more efficient earlier on if I did more accessory, more variance of the main movements. So general development is going to make you more efficient because the more well-rounded you are, the tighter you can keep position, more different positions you can work into and get a good result. It's like being a good athlete. You can play a lot of different sports while being well-rounded in physical development, and having a well-rounded physique is going to allow you to do a lot of different movements, and it will help you in all ways. Targeted development is another aspect of accessory, and it's what most people probably think about, and that's just reinforcing underdeveloped areas. That's also important, but most of you, not all, but most of you aren't necessarily in that camp where you should be hyper fixating on your weaknesses. If you have glaring weaknesses from being new or from having a hyper-focused program, that gets fixed with general development, with just incorporating the things you should have been doing anyways, just a few basic variations and some basic isolation stuff that has to be rotated through anyways. You have no business rigging up elaborate exercise with bands, specialty bars, working at different heights, constantly screwing around with your grip or stance. Most of you just need a few basic variations and a good kind of solid bodybuilding base to most of your training. But that is the point of accessory. So the different types they fall into, the type that most of you probably think of, and by the way, I'm not going to like split hairs on language. I understand that we could talk about accessory, supplemental work, variations. If you have different lingo for like isolation movements or smaller bodybuilding movements, I don't care. I'm talking about anything that isn't the main lift that is supposed to pump up your main lift. That's all I really care about. Mechanically similar movements. I got this from Brian Carroll's book, actually, which I can't think of a better way to describe what most people think of accessory work. That is a movement that looks more like your main lift than it doesn't. Because there's a spectrum here. It's not going to be very binary. There's some qualitative analysis that has to be done. But we're talking about slight changes to the main movement. So like a pause squat. It's pretty much a squat, but there's a variation that makes it a little harder in one particular point, and that's a value. Close grip benching, changing your grip a little bit, doesn't entirely change the movement. Now, if we go one step further, we can do something very similar to the movement that has obvious direct carryover to it, but looks a lot different. So it's not something that you might be doing, say, 2 weeks before a big meet, because it's not that specific. Generally helpful, but not that specific. So compound accessories, good mornings to your deadlift. Good mornings are a fantastic exercise for building up hip extension. They are not as good, or at least not as directly related to deadlifting ability. And there might be people who have leaned on good mornings their entire life. They think, my deadlift lives or dies with my good morning. That's fine. But the point is, mechanically, it's not as similar. The neurological action is not as similar. If you are a very, very, very dialed in deadlifter, then no, good mornings would not be your go-to. Dips are another good one. Fantastic upper bodybuilder. You can use it to build pecs, shoulders, triceps, whatever you like. Excellent movement. Will make your bench press bigger or your pressing ability greater in very broad terms. Not mechanically quite the same. Unilateral work's a good example. Split squats, right? There are a lot of different squat variations, but a split squat works all the same muscles, just not the same way. But that all has value. And then lighter accessories. I say lighter, it doesn't have to be light, but generally things that force you into a very weak position, or things that are more supported, or things that basically require changes where you can't quite work load the same. So you're talking about machines, dumbbells, cables, small movements like isolation. This is where we get surgical and pick up movements. And we'll get into that too, because part of targeting weak areas is either looking at the movement pattern and training the pattern, or looking at the muscle that is lagging. If you can reverse engineer from what you know about where you fail and say, oh, that must be this muscle, and then isolation work might be warranted. So those are two different approaches, and they're both effective if you know kind of how and when, and that does take some trial and error. So mechanically similar movements, I break them down into some distinct categories: advantaged and disadvantaged. Advantaged movements of mechanically similar movement variations are ones where you are in a better leverage position, where range of motion might be a bit shorter, things that generally lend itself to more weight moved for the same unit of effort. Overload movements are typically what you might think of as an advantage movement. And this, of course, is advantage relative to your normal setup, because your normal setup, if you're a powerlifting nerd, is already going to be as advantaged as possible. But this is taking it one step further. So, board presses, shorten the range of motion. You can potentially work up to a fuck ton on board presses. You can just board press so much if you train it. Most of you can't board press that much over your bench because you don't board press a lot. So partials do have a role to play, especially at key times. Trap bar is another good example. Not only do they tend to be higher up, so shorter range of motion, even if you use the low handles, it's closer to your center of mass. So the bar isn't in front of you anymore, getting in the way of your damn shins. So you're stronger there. It's more advantage because the weight's closer to your hips. Banded work is another good example. You can really overload the top, so it's advantage in that way. So it's great for overload, training the nervous system to handle more weight, to liberate more motor units at once and do so quicker. And that's great for strength and power development. So this comes into peaking, right? If you're preparing for a big meet, old school guys realize that if they did really heavy walkouts a couple weeks or as like the last phase before a meet, that it would help them on contest day. So general CNS work has direct peaking advantage. And this work is generally going to be heavy for that reason. But it can also be used to target certain weaknesses. If you're weak at specific spots, sometimes getting into these advantage exercises are going to help you out. But that has more to do with how similar it is to the patterning you need around that spot you tend to be weak at. And we'll cover that as well. Disadvantage movements, you're talking about a much longer range of motion, more time under tension, worse leverage. The fact that you're disadvantaged will require weight to be lower. And there's a neat thing that goes on there because effort can be high, but because the load is lighter, even if you're straining, the fact is you're not very efficient. This is very akin to being a newbie because that's why novices can train repeatedly at high intensities and not fall apart. It's because they're not trained enough to reach that upper limit in order to create this huge systemic stress. So basically training is like taking the governor off your car a little bit more each time until all of a sudden you're capable of putting the engine under immense amount of stress. So that's very, very similar to what goes on in disadvantaged variations. Again, you can also use it to work weaknesses. If you can connect it to a certain pattern where you're deficient, or if you can connect it to a particular muscle that has to work harder in this disadvantaged position to adapt, and that's going to carry over. So there is a bit of critical thinking there. But in terms of programming, you can understand that a unit of hard effort with a disadvantage variation doesn't quite burn you out, even though it seems like it'd be counterintuitive. It's not going to wreck you the way it would with your competition setup. And that's ways to sneak in work that is going to be specific to what you're doing without wrecking your recovery. So that can be very, very useful. In fact, and I know I've talked shit in the past, but brilliant move by Louis Simmons with Westside. That's exactly why the system works the way it does, is because they didn't want to have to deload. They wanted to be able to max out every single week in the most specific thing they could train, which in his mind was a 1-rep max if you're a powerlifter. And the way you do that and recover is by making subtle changes. So you're inefficient. Now, they usually use more overloaded movements, but the fact that they're novel is kind of what does that. So disadvantaged movements, very much the same. So that's an important tidbit if you're trying to really break open and analyze recovery in your program. Now, these are great for hypertrophy. Again, range of motion, time under tension. That's back to like the Weider principles. So great for size development, especially if it's more than what you're used to getting in your training. So general development works very well. Generally used for more volume because those are kind of volume components. You can think of 1 rep having more work within it. So that's a way I like to think about it. And for that reason, disadvantaged movements work really, really well at the beginning when you're in volume or hypertrophy phases, when you're trying to add slabs of muscle onto you and round out those exposed weak areas. Where advantage movements, because they go so well with the peak anyways, with all that neurological action, they go a lot better more towards the end. And there might be a time and place to jumble that up depending, but that's a general rule that's pretty easy to abide by. So you might be thinking further out when I'm in a base phase, I'm hypertrophy, more variation, get uncomfortable, reinforce these weak areas. You might be thinking things that force you into an awkward position. That might be where front squats are heavy. Whereas front squats don't get heavy enough to really provide a lot of carryover to your squat. So right before a contest might not be the best way to go. Similar for something like a stiff leg deadlift. Fantastic developer for the posterior chain. Again, you don't quite get as heavy, and the positioning is just different enough that it's going to lose very, very specific carryover that you want to drill closer to a meet. So that way of thinking, it goes very well with this way that we think about training and preparing for a competition. So for the immediate, for deciding exercise selection, this is what happens when I have a template to read off of. I'm like Ron Burgundy. I just read through the teleprompter. That man will read anything. Immediate goal decides exercise selection. So what you need to do right now is ask, do I need mass or force production? Now I know we can deconstruct all of this because any amount of training in some sense is going to increase force production. Any amount of training in some sense is going to increase mass. And that's also a useful thing to know. But we're talking about specialization, which is kind of what the point of working these different phases is. It doesn't have to be hyper specialized, but you do need some lean, some bias one way or the other. And that's part of a long-term training strategy, not from this week to next week, or not from this month to next month, but over a longer period of time, at least. And this is going to be important in every periodized program you ever run. So general development, like we keep talking about, again, it's so important for so many of you guys, and so many of you just forget about it, put it on the back burner. It is the quickest way for novices to get stronger. Disadvantage variations are great. It's not the only thing, but they're great. Peaking out strength, advantage / overloaded movements tend to be great. Focus targeting. So trying to target a particular weakness, which I would say is only appropriate for kind of mid-intermediates and up. If you're to the point where you're thinking you're competitive in a powerlifting meet, where you think you can go into a strongman meet and do well, you're probably an intermediate. And that means that you are now advanced enough to start really kind of picking apart where you're deficient. Whereas the rest of you, it's mostly general stuff. But focus targeting, where you're looking at weaknesses and saying, how do I improve this? You're going to go with the closest movement pattern. If it lines up where you can select one or the other based on how it lines up with your phase, whether you're in a volume, hypertrophy, accumulation, whatever, base phase, or whether you're in a peak phase, a heavier, more specialized phase, that's all the better, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So if you are, for instance, focused on your inability to lock weight out when it's more than 3/4 up in a bench press, there's no way around it. That's lockout strength. That's top end. That's where you're weak. And I know people like this. Leroy Walker trained at my gym a handful of times. It's 3 or 4 years ago, back in the day. No, it might have been longer. He was still benching back then. Might be talking about a solid 5 or 6 years ago. Either way, Leroy, very big guy, very strong. I watched him get 3/4 of the way up with a 700-pound bench and miss. All right? He benched with a close grip. He liked to get all that compression in his elbows and shoulders at the bottom, blow it up off his chest with all kinds of speed. Sick, really sick speed for handling 700 pounds in hand. He just had this abysmal lockout strength. And it was probably a byproduct of working into his strength for so many years. He was fast at the bottom. You can think of deadlifters who are the same, disgustingly fast off the bottom for whatever reason, but everything over 70% looks like molasses. And that's from working into your weaknesses and letting this either positioning or muscular problem persist. So to fix that, you either, like I said, focus on the pattern, and you're going to pick the movement that's closest to that pattern regardless, or you're going to deconstruct which muscles are deficient and find what to train that way. So the timeline, and I know I'm beating all this into the ground. Base phase, more volume. Think size, think bodybuilding. Bigger slab of marble to work with. Peak phase, more load, more force production. Lockout work is kind of a default, again, for the CNS stimulation, in addition to whatever potential weak point training that can be, or rounding you out that can be, and heavier work in disadvantaged areas. So in a peak phase, you might do deficits or you might do pause work, but you're focusing on speed and being explosive so that it carries over to game day. So even that's more neurological than it is mass. So it's a little different lean on that. Other compound accessories, movements that are less mechanically similar. These are great because they don't impact the recovery of the main lift nearly as much. So I was talking about movements that are smaller, lighter, more inefficient. These are movements where we cannot stress ourselves to the degree that we can with a topped out barbell lift that we are absolutely level 99 in. Those are the ones we can kill ourselves with and that we need weeks to deload from. You don't need that from machines, dumbbells, unilateral work, isolation work, and so on. And for that reason, they should generally come after the mechanically similar movement, especially after the main movement. There are some times where you might put them before, but generally, if you're doing anything that looks like specialized strength training, you don't want to pre-fatigue too much. In a base phase, you can. I've experimented with that, doing flies as a warm-up before benching or other things, upper back work before you deadlift, and that can be warranted in certain situations, but you want to make sure that the work you do with those movements isn't blowing out or affecting your performance in the main lift. How these other compound accessories work in peak phases, it's determined entirely by personal preference. Once you've been around long enough and you've put these programs together, time is going to tell which movements directly improve your peak performance. And you might find that there's some that you've trained diligently and for a long time, and you find that, well, when this one thing is up, everything else goes great. For me, it was reverse hyper. And I think I've talked shit about it in the past. I need a list of things that I had to put my foot in my mouth over because I had real strong opinions and ended up looking stupid when I ended up changing my mind. So that was one where my erectors thickened out in a way that they just really didn't with normal hip extension stuff. And I've been doing deadlifts heavy, deadlifts for volume, deadlift for reps, a whole bunch of strongman movements, good mornings, RDLs, dumbbell stuff, isolate, whatever. I started doing RDLs and I immediately, over a couple of weeks, felt my erectors thicken out in a way that they never did. Made a huge difference along with all the other bracing stuff I did. So that's a good example. If I was getting ready for a big deadlift event, I would do a ton of reverse hypers all the way up to the meet, probably until a week or two before. So that's personal preference. That's you figuring your body out. It's like solving a puzzle. Don't take for granted that you can just follow a template and it will all work out the same. You have to know what ticks. You have to know where you're deficient and think critically about what might go in there. But that's not going to fall into a very basic template. And look at this. This didn't format right. The third bullet point is hanging off the screen. That's what I get for using free software provided by Google. Lighter accessory stuff, machines, cables, dumbbells, isolation. Again, easy to recover from. You can do them high frequency. A lot of talk recently about how the one body part per week method of training for bodybuilding is kind of outdated, and you really can benefit from doing 2 or even 3 times a week for certain muscle groups if you're isolating. That also goes for us meatheads that are strength oriented because we can do feeder days or GPP days that involve smaller isolation work that adds overall volume to the stuff that we need augmented. So arm work, for instance. If you're writing a program, it might be so full of compound movements that you think are vital, you just don't have time to do more than a couple of sets of arms at the end. So having another day where you do that, that can work out well. There's a lot of opportunities to sneak that work in, so there's really no excuse. Exclusively high volume work. Usually you're going to ditch this stuff going into peak prep or contest prep or a really, really intense phase because this is an easy way to eliminate extra stress and increase recovery. I say use these liberally. Most of you aren't doing enough. Most of you could probably do more. If I had my way, just about everybody would be doing a main lift, a mechanically similar movement, and then the rest would just go down the line of like 5, 6, 7 different exercises done very, very fast to where the whole workout doesn't go longer than an hour 20. And I think that's viable. I think all of you can train that way. You just have to know that's how you should be training and put yourself on the clock, hold yourself accountable. But you would be amazed at what increasing the lighter accessory work does. I'm telling you, if you take it seriously, it's so stupidly easy. Now for targeting weaknesses, and I talked about this earlier, you have to understand attacking the movement versus the muscle. So we talked about locking out. That's the patterning of that. The movement pattern you would work on is everything that happens above the point where the bar slows down. So the idea is the bar heaves off your chest really fast. You hit no man's land. Some of you long-limbed bastards probably have this problem. You have this gap in the middle. It's this canyon you have to cross. If you can press fast enough to get past it, you can lock out no problem. But once you start to slow, if that bar stops, you're 3/4 the way up, and it's hopeless. Nothing you do, no spitting, screaming, squirming is going to get that weight locked out. So one of the things you can do is look at that pattern and say, I need to train that pattern more. Well, where am I weak? Well, the midpoint I slowed down and that affects my ability to lock out. Maybe I should expose myself to more stress around that point. Okay, you can set the bar somewhere around that point. You can experiment right at it, a little below, a little above. You can do pin presses from the bottom to get comfortable generating force from a dead stop so you don't have to rely on momentum once the bar already gets moving. You'd be surprised how much momentum accounts for. Right at mid-shin or below your knees in a deadlift, very common point. People never, ever do work where they are at a dead stop around that point. Generally, they don't. And the end result is that they get weak because the bar is never at that point. You're never loaded at that point where there isn't momentum on the bar. And it's an entirely different story when the bar slows down. So doing reps at that spot, extending the amount of time you're at that spot, that's all very viable for increasing maybe muscle around that area, certainly increasing neurological activity around that area to make you more resilient so you don't fall apart once you get there. So that's the pattern. That is looking at the movement and using similar exercises to get you better there. The muscle would be looking at which muscle's lagging. I mean, in a lockout, we generally think triceps, though it can come down to other things. It could be, let's say that as you press, you do a shitty job of keeping your shoulders back. So the shoulders roll forward as you press. So now you have this joint that's doing all this work and all of these muscles are just firing so hard and fast. And you get all of this instability as your shoulders round forward. And you get halfway up and your pecs are fully contracted. They can't contract anymore because your shoulders are all the way rounded. And you lose all of this stability, which absolutely fucks your ability to have a strong, decisive lockout. If you look at competitive lifters, they floss through. You see they keep their shoulders back and they're almost like the deadlift cue I give. Think of pushing your hips forward, not pulling the weight up to lock it out. It's the same thing. You'll see these excellent benchers focus on gliding their elbows through to lockout instead of just pushing the weight to lockout. So stability could be it. And you might identify this other weakness. But generally, we look at these spots and we say, okay, well, that tends to be triceps or this tends to be quads. So if you can reduce down, if you can eliminate all of the other potential variations and pinpoint it to a muscle, that's where taking advantage of all this lighter accessory work comes in. And like I said, it is so easy. So an example, base phase. And I really love scheduling workouts like this. I do high frequency stuff occasionally. It's valuable. I generally do it on a case-by-case basis with people that have reasons they should or need to train high frequency. But guys, there are so many people that are the best in the world that train this way. And this is how people generally used to train for a long time anyways. It's user-friendly. It works extremely well. I just had Cody on from GZCL, and this is essentially what he does. We've seen it in so many popular programs, and it populates the top 10, top 100 lists of any class you might look at on open powerlifting. More people have gotten good training like this than have gotten good using these really convoluted methods of high frequency. So just follow the logic here. Main movement first, you do it when you're fresh. If you're a sprinter, you are not going to do 100-meter sprints after you ran a mile because you will no longer be training speed as a quality. Your power production will suffer. You will be training those endurance faculties because you will be wiped. And that's not productive to having this big 100-meter sprint. You get it? So for lifting, if we're doing a strength-oriented movement first, you need to be somewhat fresh for it. Not entirely. Don't be a diva. Don't be one of those like, well, I couldn't help my friend move the day before because I had to lift. Or I'm not going to do cardio because I don't want to be fatigued. I don't want any more systemic stress. I got to just eat ho-hos and sit on the couch and watch my YouTube channels. And that's going to just leave me completely recovered so I can dominate squat day. In general, you need to be somewhat fresh. So in this example, bench workout, lockout focused. That's my weakness. I'm interested in general development, building mass generally, but also keeping in mind I have this thing that tends to hold me back. So this base phase, what is my purpose? More variety, more volume, round out weak areas. So my main movement, benching, can't beat that. Mechanically similar movement, close grip bench. I'm a big fan of close grip benches anyways. They're great as a basic developer. Again, disadvantaged grip, more range of motion, great for general pressing power and general upper body development. Few sets of 6 to 8. Rep range is a little bit higher. The same or just a little bit higher than what your main lift is. Going into weighted dips. So now we're in other territory. Very beneficial, ton of carryover. Not mechanically similar though. Neurological activity is going to be a little more deviated. So performance here doesn't matter so much as fatigue. I want you to remember that when we're doing mechanically similar movements, performance is a big deal. It's a very big deal. So you need to perform similarly to how you would perform on your main lift. Once you're out of that place, once you're out of the woods there, you can go ham. You just want decimation. Yeah, there might be some progression you're following, but just stress is the name of the game. And because these aren't mechanically similar, they have a very limited ability to impact neurological recovery. So dips, I'm a big fan of. Now we're in hypertrophy range, 10 to 12. Ooh, 4 sets? That's cardio, bro. 4 sets at 10 to 12? What is this, a men's fitness article? Am I on T-Nation right now? What is going on here? Dumbbell benching, a great movement, a lot of stability. Again, a lot of you hate it because it requires getting out of breath, picking up the dumbbells, lugging them over, setting them on your legs, trying not to look stupid while you kick them up into position. Dumbbells are fantastic. And it's a good way to reduce stress off your shoulders. You can change the way you press to kind of alleviate stress off problem areas. So I love dumbbell benching. It's good to have, it's essentially unilateral. It's good to have some unstable movements, especially in a base phase where you're not worried about maximal weight. And then triceps. Got the dips fatigued a little bit. Sorry, you got the triceps fatigued a little bit with benching. You got the close grip bench really drove the point home. Weighted dips, by that time, they're screaming. By that time, they're starting to get pumped and cramp up. You're like, oh, my triceps are tired. A little more benching after that with the dumbbells. And then you go into French presses, which I like is kind of a medium heavy tricep exercise. They also tend to be a little easier on the elbows than skull crushers. So FYI. And then cable press downs. Smaller muscle groups when they lag, delts, triceps. I mean, there's examples of these small muscle groups that really are stubborn and they become a problem. My erectors are a good example. Some high rep, 15, 20 rep work. Sometimes that's the thing that builds this little bit of receptivity. Like it can be good for growth. If you were so shitty at fiber recruitment because they just weren't getting hit with the main movements, sometimes going really, really high rep and feeling those deep motor units get recruited and feeling that burn where they said the muscle starts to get twitchy. It's like the first time you bounce your pecs. It's like, oh my God, I feel my tricep. Like, is that what it feels like to use your triceps when you bench? Really high rep shit that just burns can sometimes be the ticket to waking up those, what I would call dormant muscles, the ones that aren't used to being pulled online. They're asleep. They've been phoning it in when the alarm's ringing. So this is how we wake them up. High rep cable press downs, band press downs, bench dips are a great one. Those are easy to do. Kickbacks. I don't give a shit. Grab the pink 5-pound dumbbells. Do 30 reps of kickbacks where you're in a steep forward bend. Holy shit. You won't be able to pick up the cell phone to call your Tinder date. It's good work. And this is enough volume. What just happened there? Oh, come on. We're doing so well. I was right up to the end. That's what happens when I use this 20-year-old trackball mouse. An example of a peak phase for benching. Sorry, I was halfway through my final thought and then my computer fritzed out. I was saying before about the base phase, a ton of reps, total sets. It's sustainable. That can be done once a week without a problem. Other day, if you want, you can do a feeder workout. If you want, you can do overhead press, shoulder emphasis. If you want, you can do some lighter benching. There's a lot of options, but that by itself is a standalone workout. Solid, perfectly good. Going into the peak phase, you should have done the base phase long enough to have gotten a little more muscle. And even if you don't look or feel bigger, you don't weigh more, you should notice your rep endurance is up. You should notice you've improved in all of the movements you've been doing and that your capacity is really good. And if you can say you got better at some of these movements that are a little heavier on the triceps or the lockout, that says a lot for what you're about to do here. So now you can start doing a lot more movement pattern targeting, a lot more really focused specific targeting that works the neurological components, which is what you need when you're skill building. So bench press, now we're at a heavier range. Instead of sets across, I had 5x5 plus on the base phase. That's 5 sets of 5, last set to failure. One of my favorite schemes. I use that a lot. Now we're into top sets. So top triple with some back off work, 10% down. Going into the mechanically similar movement. Now we have 2. We're more specific in a peak phase. So more work is going to come from compounds and close variations of the main lift. Pin bench presses are great. Close grip benches are still great. Couple sets, 3 to 6 reps. So I got 3 to 5 reps on the pin bench, 4 to 6 reps on the close grip bench. It's kind of arbitrary. I went a little bit higher rep because of close grip. Again, I think lighter movement. A lot of this is arbitrary. Don't sweat these little changes in set and rep schemes. A lot of it is just static noise. Into the other accessory, the vital stuff that works, it transfers, but it's not as mechanically similar. JM presses, fantastic. It's like a heavier, more serious French press. It's a mix between a tricep extension and an actual press. So I think it does a good job of teaching you how to floss your elbows through, of really kicking your elbows in to finish off that movement. Jam presses are great and they're heavy. That's a good movement to get heavy that will transfer over to your competitive work. And then the light work, band press downs. High reps, smoke the triceps, easy to recover from, good for getting blood in. Maybe your elbows are starting to feel beat up in the heavier phase. So stuff that drives a ton of blood in. Band work is great for that, for warming up trouble areas and for smoking them at the end of the workout. Great for getting the tendons to grow. You need a lot of blood flow to get the tendons thickened out. If you don't do a lot of pump work, they might not thicken out as fast. That's an arm wrestling tip I got from guys that need those thick tendons. They don't have the option of just doing a little bit of lifting, a little bit of time on the table and hoping that it's enough. They got to thicken out their fingers and wrists. And that's one of the tricks a lot of those guys use. So you can see how these principles might be applied to other exercises, how you might structure workouts with, say, deadlifts, the order you might put in a deadlift versus a rack pull. Okay, well, why would I do a rack pull? Because they're fun? Absolutely, they're fun. But what do they do? Okay, well, if I'm sticky at that point around the knee, maybe that'll help. Okay, where are you sticky? Is it 13, 16, 18 inches? Well, right below the kneecap, right at about 17 inches is no man's land. I'm fine above or below. Okay, well, don't go above or below. If you're working that weakness, that's where it needs to be if you want that motor patterning benefit. What else do they do? Well, the potential to lift weights higher, more CNS stimulation. Okay, so do I want to exploit that? And if I do, when's that going to be featured? The base phase or the peak phase? If you were listening, you should be able to answer that. So this should give you some conceptual insight into how we select these movements, how we think of them differently, and how that informs our decision to pick them and put them into a program. So that is all I've got for today. I wish I had a flow chart I could give you that makes all of these decisions for you. Unfortunately, I do not. This is the underlying conceptual model that you're going to use moving forward. But yes, you do have to apply a ton of trial and error and just talk to as many people as you can, specifically people who seem similar to you or have had issues that you have. And that will help you with some potential shortcuts, but there's no way around it. Start out with what you think makes sense. Take notes as you go, adjust as needed, and use this conceptual discussion to help inform those decisions. So hopefully you guys pulled something out of this. I know I've covered these topics before and a lot of this can be redundant, but I just started using the slideshow and I think it's helping out my ability to stay on task on these podcasts. So I'm going to continue using them and I'm probably going to use it on a bunch of videos I did before I thought were pretty shitty. So this is one of them. Thank you so much for watching, guys. To find out more, Base Strength and my other books are on Amazon and EmpireBarbellStore.com. Paperback is on Amazon only. They're just faster and they were fucking up less. Personalized 12-week templates and one-on-one mentorship is available. I've been ramping up online coaching. I had problems with it in the past. I got frustrated by not being able to be in the room with you and be a control freak. But I've grown a lot with this, talked to some people who are very good at structuring this stuff, and I've gotten some good workarounds so that I actually feel confident that I can help you with where you need to be helped instead of just copying and pasting a template. There's a questionnaire. There's a lot of hands-on work, a lot of filming, a lot of back and forth. You get the benefit of having my personal cell phone number. That's worth it by itself. And Patreon and Facebook, those are the places to either interact with or support me. Patreon and YouTube memberships, of course, are paid, but that's what allows me to do this. So I appreciate everybody's support there. The Base Strength Forum is absolutely free. A lot of good people there. Yes, I did. I called them quality. Somebody left a comment in the forum. He posted, he said, did Alex call us quality? Yes, we have quality members in the Base Strength Forum. They're very helpful. A lot of them can answer questions on my behalf by having read through my stuff. I think that's pretty cool. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop by any of those platforms and they will be answered. Thank you so much for stopping by, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.